Okay, good evening everyone. Tonight I am in the hot seat tonight. I don't know who's more scared and shocked, you guys or me, but here I am. And we are busy with the life of Christ, the best life ever lived, Jesus. And tonight we're doing chapter 29. And it's the aloneness of Christ. Now, that is a very interesting topic. I'm not going to lie to you. When Pastor Carl told me last week, okay, now it's your turn, and I saw it was the aloneness of Christ, I felt very alone with this topic because it has so many different aspects, and the word aloneness has so many different definitions it can run to in itself, that you can actually talk about a lot of stuff with just the title, the aloneness of Christ. So the reason I think it is a good topic to talk about is loneliness, and aloneness is something that we've all experienced. Whether it be because you're genuinely alone in life, or whether it be there's someone that nobody can relate with you with a topic, or you're busy and you're alone. Somewhere we have all experienced aloneness and loneliness. So it's very relevant to each of our lives, but we don't often talk about the fact that it's also very relevant to the life of Christ. Because it's something that he's definitely gone through as well. As we all know, Jesus was put on this earth not only to die for our sins, but to also walk the best life ever lived and give us that example. So that means he went through stuff that we face today, and he modeled a great way for how to navigate those stuff. So we get to draw from that. So he too experienced loneliness. So tonight we're going to look at how he dealt with it and how he positioned his life that sometimes had loneliness to become a powerful solitude. So that's what we're going to look at. So it in turn became a powerful attribution in his life. And I just want to start with the quote of C.S. Lewis. In his book, The Weight of Glory, he said the following: "We live, in fact, in a world starved for solitude, silence, and private, and therefore starved for meditation and true friendship." So if you look at the word of aloneness, I think it has two different aspects. It has a positive aspect if you deal with aloneness positively, and it has a negative aspect as well. So aloneness dealt with negatively will lead to loneliness, and it will lead to isolation, which is the negative aspect of the word aloneness, and it's a negative effect that it has on a person's life. So we're going to talk about aloneness a lot, and we're going to talk about loneliness and the effects it has on your life, and we're going to talk about solitude and the effects that it has on your life, because the positive attribute of aloneness is solitude, a place of rest, a place of taking a breather. So Jesus had that aspect in his life as well. We read about it a lot in the scripture, where he took some time and alone time to go and sit at the Father's feet. So we're going to look at all that, but I want us to focus on loneliness first, and the dangers of loneliness. Now, Apostle Jan had a whole study printed out here on the dangers of loneliness. So I'm just quickly going to read a paragraph of that, because it's a lot of words and I cannot say it out of my head. That's going to be terrible. Okay, so loneliness and isolation are no joke. Loneliness actually increases the risks of premature mortality amongst all ages. One recent study indicates that social isolation and loneliness lead to more people dying than obesity. Isolation has been linked to a number of dysfunctional immune responses and high blood pressure that have an impact on our overall well-being. In fact, researchers have found that people who are lonely produce more inflammation-related proteins in response to stress than people who are more social. The reactions of these inflammation-related proteins can be associated with numerous disease states, such as coronary heart disease, type 2 diabetes, arthritis, and Alzheimer's. And then on the emotional side, every human being needs meaningful relationships within which they can develop identity, and each one can flourish in life. The absence of these relationships can often lead to suicide. We need to take loneliness very seriously if someone takes their own life every 40 seconds. So that was very wild for me to read, and that's why I decided I'm going to read it just as is, because if you look at the statistics of loneliness, then you realize that even though it's a very small word, it can have a massive impact in someone's life if aloneness is dealt with wrong, and if aloneness isn't dealt with in a biblical way, if I can put it like that. And we all know the seriousness of suicide, and to think that it's a thing of aloneness, sometimes us being busy and not realizing that the person next to us is going through a alone time, that having friends and having that support group can help you and pull you out of that isolation and aloneness. So aloneness is very, very serious, and it's the negative part of loneliness is the negative part of aloneness. And then we look at the positive side, which is solitude, which can have a powerful impact on your life. So loneliness can have a negative impact, but solitude can have a powerful impact on your life. I mean, I think of our lives that's so busy. Sometimes we genuinely just feel overwhelmed with emotions, or overwhelmed with what the day has genuinely just thrown at you. And sometimes it just takes a few moments of solitude, peace and quiet to just process what happened in your day or what happened in your situation. But sometimes we find ourselves so busy that we don't get to that place of solitude, so we never get to the processing part, and we just keep on going and going, and that could also turn into loneliness because you never speak of what you're going through. So it can have a powerful impact if you just take a moment of solitude and rest. And practical examples of that is music, for example. So when I saw this example, it immediately spoke to me because I, as you guys know, love music and I'm very involved with it. So music has pauses and it has breaks. In a song, or sometimes, let's speak specifically church orientated in worship, you get pauses and breaks where there's kind of a Selah moment. I think Carl said it this Sunday, there was this holy moment in worship where it was just, you could feel the weightiness. And at one stage I was looking at him behind the piano, and he kind of looked like he didn't want to continue playing piano. He didn't want Ilona to continue with the announcements. He didn't want anything to continue because it was such a holy moment, and he just wanted us all to Selah in that moment. So you get that in music, and you get that in worship, and it's usually it goes hand in hand with powerful moments in worship. And then you also get that in poetry and sentences. I mean, every sentence has a full stop at the end. So every sentence has to end and has to have a resting place. Even a comma indicates a resting place. But life itself is very noisy and doesn't necessarily stop. So like I said, let's have a look at Jesus's life and how he dealt with these things. How he navigated loneliness and turned it into powerful solitude, because, like I said earlier, he's the perfect example. So my first point I want to make is Jesus understands loneliness, okay? So not necessarily the aloneness part yet, but he understands loneliness, going through something alone. And for that we have Isaiah 53 verse 3 as reference, where it says, "He is despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised and we did not esteem him." So I think that verse is pretty much self-explanatory, where they themselves said, we hid our faces from him. He was despised. It creates a picture of what Jesus had to go through on earth in just a small sentence. But the next verse I want us to look at, and we can turn there in our Bibles, is Hebrews 4 verse 15, just to continue looking at the point that Jesus not just understands loneliness, but he also understands rejection. So that's Hebrews 4 verse 15. 4 verse 15. 4:1-5. And if you have it, you can read it.
For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet was without sin.
So just imagine real quick how alone Jesus had to feel to live in a world where he was the only one that didn't sin. I mean, I don't think anyone could relate to him even today with that part. And that verse says it so beautifully that even though he went through the same emotions and temptations and stuff that we face today, he went through it all without sinning. So he was able to say at the end of the day, I never sinned. He showed the perfect example. But while he was here on earth, and he was in the process of not sinning, he couldn't identify with one person around him that went through the same. There was no one that could relate to how he was living life. And he couldn't relate to anyone because in that regard, because, you know, it was an unrighteous time and there was sin around him. And to prove that point further, 2 Peter 2 verse 8, if someone can look for that, please. 2 Peter 2 verse 8.
This man, living among them day after day, was tormented in his righteous soul by the lawless deeds he saw and heard.
Yes, okay, so for the righteous man was tormented in his righteous soul for the lawless deeds that he experienced around him. When I read that, while I was preparing, I thought to myself, well, tormenting is such a massive word. Just imagine real quick, I mean, he was Jesus. And his whole thing was showing love to other people, and he was amongst us, and he was amongst all these unrighteous people, and he was the only righteous one among them. I think he must have felt very lonely. I mean, I think of myself when I walk into a place where people aren't necessarily living like Christians should live, you know, and I'm the only one there that's, say, not drinking or smoking or using crude words. I immediately feel uncomfortable and I immediately feel alone, and I don't really have anyone to talk to because it's just an uncomfortable atmosphere. And that's the atmosphere that Jesus lived while he was walking the earth. It literally said there that he felt tormented in his soul because of the unrighteous around him. So that is, I think, a very high level of loneliness to go through. I mean, imagine feeling tormented in your soul. And remember, for a long time, Jesus did things quietly as well. So imagine feeling tormented in your soul about how people around you are living, but you can't necessarily do anything about the way they are living, or you tell them, hey, the way you're living isn't correctly, and they're not listening to you, and you're literally the only person that's willing to stand up for that. I think that could be a very lonely place. And I mean, I thought about an instance where I went through with my previous job, where there were a lot of stuff happening that wasn't necessarily correct biblically or just in general I didn't agree with. But I couldn't speak to the people at work about it because they were the people that were doing the wrong things. So when I was at work, I felt that loneliness of being, you know, annoyed and upset and tormented in my spirit, but I couldn't necessarily speak about it because then I'd be speaking to the people who were tormenting me, you know. And so that was what Jesus was facing in that moment. So that was a feeling of aloneness, a feeling of feeling out. Ek weet nie hoe om dit anders te stel nie. Jy voel nie in nie, jy voel uit. Okay? And then if you look at his earlier years, I mean, just if you look at the birth of Jesus, I mean, just around Mary's birth, there was a lot of controversy about the fact that Jesus was an illegitimate child. And I personally don't think that controversy stopped the moment Jesus was born. I think as a family they probably received a lot of torment and negative words and judgment because of the fact that Jesus was an illegitimate child. And I don't think it was necessarily just amongst friends or people in the town. I think it possibly was in his family as well. I mean, if someone had to come to me right now and say, "Hey, I'm carrying baby Jesus," I would think, "Listen, you're crazy until being proven otherwise." You are crazy until proven otherwise. And I think that is how most of Jesus' family members must have felt. That is how the people in their town must have felt. And it probably continued until the day that they actually realized, oh my gosh, he's risen from the dead. And that must be a very lonely place. To, be labeled as something that you are not. To know that you have this high identity, but people see you as, gum underneath your shoe. And he couldn't, I think, fully live himself out like he could have, because he got persecuted, I think already at a young age, just for who he was in that regard. And then if you look at John 7 verse 5, it says, "For even his brothers did not believe in him." So that means even his brothers and his family did not believe in him, like I said earlier. They must have had a lot of questions of where the son and brother came from.
And then they are told the whole time that he's amazing and he's the Messiah. Can you imagine?
Yeah, exactly.
He just always does everything right, yeah?
Yeah.
I mean, it must have been very interesting. And somewhere in Apostle Jan's notes, he also said he feels like there's a reason why Jesus didn't choose his brothers and his sisters to be part of the disciples. And this could be the reason. The fact that, a prophet isn't known in his own town. So he had no one whom he could really identify with, or anyone that could really understand him. And the example that Apostle Jan also uses here is, it's like a gifted kid, a very smart kid that's extremely gifted in a sense, that's sometimes excommunicated through peers because they don't necessarily know social cues, but they're smart. So actually they need to be celebrated for who they are, but because of the fact that they don't do stuff the way society does it, they become excommunicated. And so he explained here that he feels like that is how Jesus must have felt. In fact, he needs to be celebrated, the fact that Jesus is on earth, the Messiah has finally came, but they're persecuting him. Okay, so he experienced loneliness in a lot, and I think in all aspects of life. I'm just quickly going to run through this. So the religious leaders didn't accept him. So literally the people who were waiting for the Messiah's return didn't realize the Messiah was there. So they didn't accept him. So he experienced rejection there and loneliness there. Then the government didn't accept him because he faced injustice. It was, I'm referring to that moment where they released Barnabas. There you go. They released him and they crucified Jesus while he was innocent. And I think in that moment, the religious leaders, they left Jesus. So his only hope was the government at that point. And then they were like, oh no, we don't want to not be in favor with the people. So, sorry, ne? So that must have made him feel very alone. And then his own people didn't accept him. The same people who glorified him for doing miracles were the same people that shouted "Free Barnabas." Were the same people that wanted him to be crucified. So they didn't accept him. And then of course Judas betrayed him and Peter denied him 3 times. And then on the cross, Jesus is even rejected by the criminals sentenced on either side of him. He had to die alone on the cross while he was innocent. And then, after all that, the Father also turned his head from him. So, I think we can agree that in literally every single aspect of Jesus' life, he experienced a form of aloneness and loneliness. And I do see significance in that, because I think in every single instance that we find ourselves in, we can feel aloneness. We can feel loneliness. And I do think that the reason Jesus experienced these things in every aspect was to show us how to deal with loneliness in every aspect. Then, of course, Jesus redeemed our loneliness and reunited us with the Father so that we can have an intimate relationship with Him, so that we can never be alone again. So Jesus didn't just die for our sins on the cross, because remember, sin isolates us from Jesus. Isolation is loneliness. So when Jesus died for our sins on the cross, He defeated loneliness as well. So in that, He reunited us with the Father, and now we get to have an intimate relationship with Him, because we get to have the Holy Spirit with Him, because of everything that Jesus did for us. So Jesus experienced loneliness on every single level, aloneness on every single level, solitude on every single level. So on every aspect of the word, no matter how you turn the word around and look at it, Jesus experienced it, and there's an example for us. Now I want us to focus on a story of friendship, and we're going to look at the story of Lazarus. Now, this was a part of the lesson where I was like, I feel a little bit alone with this, because I was like, I don't understand how this comes into play with aloneness. But while delving into this lesson and everything, I saw a perspective on the story of Lazarus's death that I've never seen before. So that's what we're going to look at. So I want you guys to turn to John 11 in the meantime, because we're going to read that passage of Lazarus's death. And it's a beautiful story about friendship and the expectation of friendship. And I just want to mention here a reminder that Jesus didn't actually need friends. He was Jesus at the end of the day. So he didn't need man or help or anything. But he still chose 12 disciples. He still chose to have people around him. He would spend time with them, and he never placed himself above him. So remember, in biblical times, if you were a priest, they were seen as very high. You couldn't necessarily just speak to them. They were important people. You had to have a special permission to speak to them. And so Jesus, being the priest of all priests, wasn't like that. He spent time with his disciples. He spent time with his followers. And he didn't at any point place himself above them. He lived an ordinary life. And yet he was so closely linked with everyone around him. And even though he was linked with everyone around him, and he had all these followers around him and these disciples that he spent so many times with, he still had moments of solitude. So that's what we're going to look at in the story, the balance between healthy solitude and then giving, sharing, and loving. So we're going to read John 11 now, but the story actually starts way before then, when Jesus has a conversation with his disciples, and he basically tells them, hey, listen, I am going to die. Now in John itself, the conversation actually happens also after Lazarus's death. But if you go and read Mark and Luke, you'll see it also happened before. So he continually told them, and actually, hy het hulle ingelig, luister, hierdie gaan gebeur, wees gereed. And they just didn't get it. So it wasn't understandable for them, and I can actually kind of understand why it wasn't understandable for them, because for so long they were walking with Jesus and they saw that he was this awesome miracle worker, and if you read Mark and Luke, he was doing a lot of healings, he was doing amazing things. So I can understand why they were like, but how can the Messiah that finally came now tell us that he's going to die? And then other than that, I'm thinking of a specific instance in I think it was Mark, where Jesus was telling them, hey, I'm going to die, and this is what's going to happen, and we need to go to this place so that this can happen. And then Peter actually thought it was a good idea to reprimand Jesus. And then Jesus had a moment where he told Peter, get behind me, Satan. It was nogal a very interesting part in the Bible, which I've been enjoying a lot lately. And while reading that part, I can identify with Peter, sort of, not really, I don't want to be called Satan, but but I can identify in the sense of everything was going so good. And they were walking with the Messiah. They were the Messiah's disciples. And now he wants to say that he's going to die. That's not going to happen. He's the Messiah. So I think, in a sense, they became a bit proud. Hulle het hoogmoedig so bietjie geraak. And I think that was a good thing that Jesus was like, get behind me, Satan, because it knocked him down a few pegs. But I think the reason they didn't understand the fact that Jesus was telling them that he was going to die is because the suffering message that Jesus was giving to them in that moment didn't fit with the stardom image they were building in their minds about him. So I think Jesus must have felt a lot of frustration with them. And I think that's where that whole explosion of get behind me, Satan, was coming from, because they were like, seriously? And I've been reading Mark a lot lately as well, and he's been doing a lot of healings in Mark and stuff. And then every single time, especially with those parts where he was feeding the 4,000 and then feeding the 5,000 and then feeding, every single time the disciples doubted and was afraid at the start. And then there was a moment where Jesus was like, seriously? Are you kidding me right now? Did you not see what I just did? And I think that must have been the frustration with Jesus telling them, hey, I'm about to die, and then they're not understanding it, because don't be afraid. Have you not met me? So that brings me to the story of Lazarus, and you're probably wondering, how is this connected? Because I was wondering, how is this connected? But so he was having this conversation with them and saying, hey, I'm going to die. And amongst that ministry that he was doing and talking to them about this, etc., the news suddenly came that Lazarus is dead. And if you look at different translations, one translation says, your friend is dying. But our other translation says, your loved one is dying. Okay? So he suddenly received this news about a friend and a loved one dying. But I actually want us to read that entire passage. Ek's regtig jammer, dis lank. But I just want us to read it to get a picture of everything that happened, and then also what is going to be said. So if anyone's willing to read a lot, show me.
Now a certain man was sick, Lazarus of Bethany, the town of Mary and her sister Martha. It was that Mary who anointed the Lord with fragrant oil and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. Therefore the sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick. When Jesus heard that, he said, this sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that he was sick, he stayed 2 more days in the place where he was. Then after this he said to the disciples, let us go to Judea again. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, lately the Jews sought to stone you, and are you going there again? Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of this world. But if one walks in the night, he stumbles, because the light is not in him. These things he said, and after that he said to them, our friend Lazarus sleeps, but I go that I may wake him up. Then his disciples said, Lord, if he sleeps, he will get well. However, Jesus spoke of his death, but they thought that he was speaking about taking rest in sleep. Then Jesus said to them plainly, Lazarus is dead, and I am glad for your sakes that I was not there, that you may believe. Nevertheless, let us go to him. Then Thomas, who is called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, Let us also go, that we may die with him. So when Jesus came, he found that he had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles away, and many of the Jews had joined the woman around Martha and Mary to comfort them concerning their brother. Now Martha, as soon as she heard that Jesus was coming, went and met him, but Mary was sitting in the house. Now Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you. Jesus said to her, Your brother will rise again. Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at that last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, he shall live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? She said to him, Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is to come into the world. And when she said these things, she went her way and secretly called Mary, her sister, saying, The teacher has come and is calling for you. As soon as she heard that, she rose quickly and came to him. Now Jesus had not come yet into the town, but was in the place where Martha met him. Then the Jews who were there with her in the house and comforting her, when they saw that Mary rose up quickly and went out, following her, saying, She is going to the tomb to weep there. Then, when Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she fell down at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Therefore, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her weeping, he groaned in the spirit and was troubled. And he said, Where have you laid him? They said to him, Lord, come and see. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, See how he loved him. And some of them said, Could not this man who opened the eyes of the blind also have kept this man from dying? Then Jesus, again groaning in himself, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay against it. Jesus said, Take away the stone. Martha, the sister of him who was dead, said to him, Lord, by this time there is a stench, who has been dead for 4 days. Jesus said to her, Did I not say to you that if you would believe, you would see the glory of God? Then they took away the stone from the place where the dead man was lying. And Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me, and I know that you always hear me, but because of the people who are standing by me, I said this, that they may believe that you sent me. Now when he said these things, he cried with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. And he who had died came out, bound hand and foot with grave clothes, and his face was wrapped with a cloth. Jesus said to them, Loose him and let him go.
Okay, we can stop there. Thank you, Sean. Okay, so we see there the beautiful story of Lazarus' death, and I think with a lot of times when we hear the story, we often hear about Jesus. We're allowed to mourn because Jesus also mourned, which is a true statement, or friendship teaching and all that type of stuff. So we're doing a friendship teaching tonight. It's an interesting twist. So I want us to start with the fact of just the matter that we know that Jesus and Lazarus were very close friends. So Jesus would live in Bethany and reside there from time to time, and when he would go there, he would stay with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. So they spent quite a lot of time together. They were great friends and stuff. So I just quickly want to paint a picture of the weight of friendship. Okay, so we all can agree that we need friends in life, whether it be for encouragement or whatever. We need friends because a good friend can help you and protect you. You get value and encouragement, and you get to share life with friends. But sometimes people do the things they normally wouldn't want to do in the name of friendship. So sometimes even if ek nie nou regtig lus nie, okay, but because we're friends, I will do that. You know, so it becomes like a loyalty thing as well. So sometimes because of the weight of friendship, we will sometimes do things that we don't necessarily want to do or, you know, need to do in that moment. So friendship in effect is actually very powerful because you feel obligated because you are friends. So I want us to direct back to the part where Jesus received the message that Lazarus was dying. So, like I said, one translation said your friend is dying, and another translation said your loved one is dying. And that wasn't it was a weighty sentence to give to Jesus. Here he is busy ministering to people. He's busy escaping death because someone just tried to stone him, if you read a bit earlier on in John, and he gets the message that your friend is dying. And what Apostle Jan says here is that it was actually a message of leverage. Because if it was just hey, Pietie gaan dood, then it probably wouldn't necessarily meant anything to Jesus. But because of the fact that it was Jesus's friend, it was a message of leverage. Come now, your friend is dying, we need a miracle now. You're busy with miracles all over, but we need the miracle here now for your friend. So it was a message of leverage, and the picture that he tries to paint is that sometimes when you're in a powerful position and an influential position, people often reach out to you to draw from that power and influence. And I'm not necessarily saying that's what Martha and Mary was doing, because I think if I was in a situation where my brother was dying, I would also definitely call to my friend that I know is the miracle worker and that I know could have the answer. But the plot twist in the story was the fact that Jesus didn't go when they asked him to. So he literally was like, he was like, I'm not going to do it now. I'm going to wait because the Father needs to be glorified. So what Jesus was doing here, and I say this very lightly because obviously we weren't there, but what he was doing there is he wasn't doing something out of selfish gain, whether it was for his friend's selfish gain or his selfish gain, because they all wanted Lazarus to live. But he was doing something because it needed to Jesus needed to be glorified in that moment, and they needed to see the glory of God. So he became 4 days late. And then afterwards, Jesus then said that he is glad that he did not go immediately because the Father was going to glorify the Son. So that's actually pure scripture. In this whole effect, he saw God's plan. He put God's plan above what his friends wanted in that moment, and even I think what he wanted in that moment. Because I don't think necessarily remember, Jesus had human emotions. I don't think it was necessarily easy for him knowing that Lazarus was dying. And I think that in itself was a lonely feeling as well. Besides the fact that his disciples were like, we can't go back there, I think he knew that it's a lonely decision to make this decision to glorify God. Because when he eventually gets there, he's going to deal with Martha and Mary, who's probably going to be mad at him. So yet he still decided to, out of that aloneness, glorify God in the situation. So when he eventually gets to Martha and Mary, we see a second point that I want to make: faith instead of offense. So you would expect offense in that moment when he eventually gets to Martha and Mary. How dare you not show up? My brother is now dead. I don't ever want to speak to you again. You are the miracle worker, and you didn't do a miracle here. He's dead. And I think it could have easily become a situation where they all were propelled into loneliness because of offense. Because remember, we're looking at the story of the death of Lazarus because we're looking at a healthy way of dealing with aloneness. And I think they all gave us that picture in this, because instead of being offended in that moment, Mary and Martha were still like, we understand, you are King of Kings, and even though you didn't come when we wanted you to, we know your will still happen. So in that all, they weren't offended to the point that they began to disbelieve the person of Jesus Christ. And the reason I think offense is here in this moment in this lesson is because offense can lead you to loneliness. The moment you decide that I have myself now in my akirek and they will never see me again because I need to be justified in this, you immediately step into isolation. You remove yourself from a healthy environment, you remove yourself from an environment that can encourage you, you remove yourself from just resolving the issue and moving on with your life. So you step into a form of loneliness and you cut off communication. That is what offense actually is. If you decide to stand in offensiveness, or not offensiveness, being offended, and not sorting it out, you cut off communication, you isolate yourself, and then you step into loneliness. So in this moment, we see a beautiful picture from Martha and Mary where they didn't act offended. Even though it didn't turn out how they wanted to initially, they still had a high regard for who Jesus Christ is, and they knew that God always works with a plan. And I do think that is because they also were very close to him, so they probably understood him in a level that the other people didn't necessarily do, because they had a good bond, they were friends. So they also knew that Jesus loved Lazarus and wouldn't necessarily do anything that wasn't the will of the Father regarding Lazarus. So offense can change the heart, but they still exclaimed that Jesus is Lord, which in itself is a beautiful lesson. But however, we are talking about loneliness, so you're probably still wondering what that has to do with the story of Lazarus and his death. So the part that I actually really want to highlight is the part that my mom spoke about earlier, where she was like, that Greek word is not a Greek word because it's unreadable. So I actually thought about it last week, Mom. When Carl asked you to say this Greek word, I said at this point people are not going to believe that we're Greeks because we can't say any of the Greek words that are here, and that is very much the case for the Greek word tonight as well. So I want us to look at John 11 verse 38, and that is just after Jesus arrived and just before he went. He was actually on his way to the grave. And I think before that it also said that Jesus wept and everything, but just before this verse it actually says that there were people that said, I think it's in verse 37. Yeah, 37. Let me just get it here in my Bible. The Jews said, see how he loved him, but some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man also have kept this man from dying? So even in his walk towards the grave, he received persecution through words. And I just want to direct you guys to what I said earlier, where I said he was already facing the frustration of the disciples not understanding the weight of what he's about to walk into. And now he's facing a death of a loved one. And now he's facing literally people persecuting him with words, judging him, literally at the grave of that loved one. So verse 38 says the following. It says, then Jesus, again groaning in himself, came to the tomb. It was a cave and a stone laid against it. So Jesus cried in this instance. But if you actually look at the Greek word, which I'm not going to pronounce right now because you're embrimamwama. Yeah, perfect Greek translation. But if you look at the actual Greek meaning of that groaning, in the original Greek that it was written in, not the modern Greek, then it doesn't mean to be sad. It doesn't mean he was mourning. What that word means is he was expressing anger. So it was, and one of the meanings of that word is actually to storm with anger. So that was like a heavy anger that he was feeling in that moment. So me, myself, can identify a little bit, because if I get stormed with anger, the first thing that happens is I start crying. And then I feel like everyone thinks I'm crying because I'm sad or whatever, and I can't speak and I can't bring my... But I'm actually heilig. I'm about to punch someone, to put it in. I'm heilig ongelukkig. You know, holy...
You're good.
Daai ene. Ja. Ja, dat gaan nou die mooi geveelde woorde sê. So if you look at that meaning of groaning, Jesus was actually angry in that moment. Now, we're not saying he was angry at Martha and Mary, because he had no reason to be angry at Martha and Mary. They just lost their brother. He just lost a friend. But I think it was a frustration build-up of the aloneness Jesus must have felt, of people not understanding what he's about to go through, people not understanding after seeing miracle after miracle and hearing of miracle after miracle of who he is. And I think at this point, he must have been so frustrated, because I think he was literally like, seriously? You have seen who I am. You know that I am the Messiah. You've literally seen the evidence of this. And now you still question me. You still are saying, hey, but if he was truly the Messiah, he wouldn't have let Lazarus die in the first place. And I think in that moment... Ja, wat the heck? Seriously? At this point, so I probably offense gevat het en het my goed gevat het en gegaan het. Because seriously, even at my friend's grave, you still don't see who I am. Even knowing where I just came from, knowing that I was busy ministering to the masses, busy performing miracles, you still don't have enough faith to realize who I am. And I think that thought alone and that frustration had to make him feel alone, because nobody could identify with that feeling in that moment. Even his disciples, we over and over told, listen, I'm about to die, just like Lazarus just died and got raised, because there's a whole part where he explains that as well. Just like that, I'm also going to go through that. He explained it over and over, and they still didn't get it. I think one of the most annoying places of aloneness you can find yourself is knowing something and nobody wants to understand you in it. Or knowing that something is the truth and the people around you are too blind to see it or can't accept that truth. And that was a different perspective on the story of Lazarus' death that I wasn't expecting while preparing for this. Because when I read that part, I always thought he was sad. And I think there was a level of sadness there. Because I would be sad if I give you the truth, if I show you who I am, and I give you the answer, and you're still not functioning in that truth like you should. And I think that must have been such an interesting place for God to be. He was so angry that it physically brought him to tears. And yeah, I think that I literally skipped a bunch of notes, and I have to figure out where I am in my notes.
Doesn't really make sense, because these two women was waiting for Jesus to come, to rise him up from the dead. So there was an expectation.
There was an expectation, but the expectation was for him to come and heal Lazarus
before
he died.
Yeah, and also I think the people around.
Around it, after he died, the people around him.
But there was a reason for that as well.
Yeah, because Jesus said at the start,
Glorify.
he's got to glorify the Son of
So yeah,
Man.
moest toeloos met de Vader.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was part of the purpose.
It
Yeah.
was
There
part
was
of the
another.
purpose.
There was another snack in this time. If you read verse, well, it says, Mary gesê on the resurrection.
Yeah. If you believe in me, I am the resurrection. I am the life.
So die twee goed loop hand in hand op.
Because people, what Andrew just says there, it's so beautiful because people want the miracle, but they don't want the I am. So if you have me, you have it. You have the resurrection, you have the life. But they want the life, they want the resurrection, but not him. So that's the frustration.
Actually, one of them could have raised Lazarus from the dead. If they believed. If as it nou mooi na die storie.
Yeah.
If we go deeper.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's another.
And I think that's where his frustration also stemmed from.
Yeah.
So you've got the answers. You know actually how to do these things. I've taught you. And there's something that I wanted to say now that I wanted to add to that, but now I cannot remember.
That they didn't want you.
Yeah, they wanted the things.
Yeah,
that he
so
was
that's
able
what
to
I
do,
actually
but they
wanted
didn't
to
want
say.
him, yeah.
So earlier I didn't say it, but now is the perfect time to say it. Is I think I did say it. Is if he went when they wanted him to go, it would have been out of selfish gain for them. It would have been, because I think a lot of times we go to God with our problems, not because he is the God, the problem solver, and we want to spend time with him, and we know if we put it in his hands, he'll sort it out whenever. We go to God with his problems out of a selfish desire. We want the answers now, we want the miracle now. And I think that was not necessarily Mary and Martha, but like they said, the people around them, is Jesus needs to come now. He needs to be here now, he needs to do the miracle now. And then he didn't do it, he did it 4 days late. And I think it was to teach that principle as well, that, God must be glorified in a situation. It shouldn't be a situation of selfish gain. We shouldn't go to the Father selfishly, but we should go to the Father to glorify the Father. So I think Jesus went through all these emotions, and I think it was a major frustration because the disciples, everyone there, they didn't realize what he was telling them. And I think it was literally, just before he was crucified, or it was nearing the part where he was going to be crucified. So he had to face those emotions that he knew this was coming. And I think it was a lot of frustration that was building up, and to live with the thought that I'm telling everyone nearest and dearest to me that I'm about to go through this and nobody's getting it. Must be that feeling of I can't even truly genuinely identify with that, because that must have been a horrible space to be in mentally. But there is good news though. In chapter 12, Mary somehow saw what he meant, and that's where she anointed his feet and cried with him. And what he was getting at in this chapter was that is what friendship is. Friendship is not what I can get, but rather I get you. And in that moment in chapter 12, where Mary was anointing Jesus' feet, she actually got him in that moment. And she actually understood the weightiness of what he was about to walk into. She was the only one, and for the first time, Jesus probably didn't feel it alone.
Can I just add to this? It's such a beautiful picture if you understand. So Jesus, in the giving, in Mary's giving, Jesus was glorified. So we've been in church for how many years, and giving in church has always been what I can get because I give. If I give my tithe, then the windows of heaven will open, and it's a true statement. The Bible just said. And all those sort of prosperity ideas. But have you ever thought about that? The way you give to God should be something that glorifies God, that brings honor to God. So she gave extravagantly, And the disciples said, you're wasting money. We could have fed how many poor people with this thing, eh? And Jesus said, you don't get the whole idea. The whole idea is it is bringing glory and honor to me. It is preparing me for the day.
She actually ministered to him in her giving.
Yeah, she ministered to him in her giving. So just take that part. In everything that we connect with Jesus with, is that something that glorifies, that brings honor to his name? Or is the way that we connect always just, what can I get? When can he give it? How is it going to come to me? How can I benefit from this? But in this we find that we are also supposed to be a benefit to Christ. And then you ask the question, how am I a benefit to Christ? Because in that I will bring glory to his name. Beautiful picture.
There's a deeper meaning to this. Because it talks about richness, not necessarily money, because the disciples were talking about the cost of the oil or perfume or whatever it is. So that was over and above. That was more. That was extravagant. So God was extravagant by giving Jesus for our sins. So this was a preemptive display of the extravagance which is to follow.
Sure, beautiful.
Yeah, it really gives a beautiful picture. And it gives a beautiful picture of balance as well. I think in general the whole story of Lazarus shows you a beautiful story of friendship when it's done correctly, but also a beautiful story of what friendship truly is, and giving above and beyond. So what it shows here, especially that part where Mary is like, okay, I see you. It's not about what I can get, but rather I get you. It shows that friendship is reciprocal. It's give and take. It's not just take.
Yeah.
It's loved to be loved, known to be known. There's a balance. So that's what Mary came, and I do think there's a significance in the fact that Mary and Martha and Lazarus were so close with Jesus. They knew him in a way that other people didn't necessarily know. So they could show that beautiful balance of friendship. And so they could show that even in a moment where Jesus had probably felt so alone, friendship can come and bring that balance. If there's understanding of one another. If there's, hey, I'm not here just to take, but I also want to give, and I want to give over and above.
And it was also a friendship that allowed him to be who he was. He was not bound in that friendship. He was free to be Jesus.
He was free to be Jesus.
Because sometimes friendships can be so clingy that you actually have to change who you are in order to be in that friendship.
That is very true.
Your resurrected life takes you out of the frotheid and the stink of death into a beautiful new creation with a lack of fragrance.
Yeah.
Lack of a better word.
And then the second thing that we can learn about this in this whole story, back at if we look at the word offense, is Jesus also did not take offense towards the ignorance around him. He got angry, he got upset, he got sad, but he didn't take offense. So he didn't allow that to isolate him. I mean, imagine if he decided at the grave he's going to take offense. They wouldn't have had that moment where Mary would have anointed his feet. And then he wouldn't have known there's someone there that's understanding. There wouldn't have been encouragement, there wouldn't have been that beautiful moment. So not only did Mary and Martha not take offense that Jesus came late because they knew there was a higher purpose, but Jesus also didn't take offense for the ignorance around him. So it once again looks at the part of offense can lead you to isolation, and this is a beautiful picture of a healthy way of dealing with aloneness. So Jesus wasn't offended. Jesus raised Lazarus and he still died for our sins, which can happen in leadership roles as well. I mean, the same goes where they could have been offended and that took them away from the presence of Jesus. Sometimes in leadership roles, leadership can get offended if people don't listen the way they should. For example, Moses missed the promised land because of anger and offense. So offense should never happen. Offense leads you to loneliness. So if we look after Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, I actually put a haha and akisiso, because Jesus literally said, give him some food, and then he left. So my interpretation there is food fixes everything. But yeah, Jesus had his need for friendship. Firstly met by the Father. That's the next point I want to make is he didn't necessarily have to stick around because his need for friendship was met by the Father. That is why Jesus didn't really need humanity, or he didn't really need to be understood or loved, because his need to be understood, loved, nurtured, and connected, he received that all from the Father. Jesus had no limit to friendship because he had a lot of people around him. He had a lot of friends. He had the 12 disciples. So there was a lot of evidence of friendships around him. But his definition of friendship was giving. Because in reality, he didn't need those friendships because he was Jesus. But he went and sat at the Father's feet. That is where he found his true friendship. And because he allowed that to fill him up, he could, out of that love and nourishment and everything that he received from the Father, give love and nourishment to the people around him. So being filled and nurtured by the Father gave him the ability to give in friendship. He could give himself to heal, love, feed, nourish, give life, and show the way everywhere he went. The friend desire was met and fed by the relationship by the Father, and that set up his earthly friendships. That is why we read about a lot of instances where Jesus sought solitude, because solitude was important. He, I think, saw the solitude as a rejuvenation moment, where he, like I said at the start, just had those moments where he processed stuff that happened in the day. He could speak to his Father, hear what he needed to do next, get direction, and that he all received in solitude. So now obviously we're moving on to the solitude part of it, and that's why, even if this stuff frustrated him because of his friendships on earth that sometimes were a bit disappointing and he felt alone, it didn't mean his detriment, because he found his worth and friendship in the Father. And I think that's a powerful place to be, because I think sometimes if we find ourselves in solitude and we find ourselves alone because we see our worth in the people around us or in the stuff around us or in our business, etc., we get into a rut, we become busy, and we forget that we can receive that from the Father. And that's actually where it should firstly come from. And you can only live this way with the people around you if we are filled, fed, and nourished in hearing God's voice and spending time with Him. So it's a balance once again. So everywhere, if we look at the story of Jesus with the story of his friendship in Lazarus, but then also later and in instances where he was in solitude, it all came back to balance. So he spent time with the Father, got nourished, received his friendship there, and because of that, he could go out and give. So it was a perfect balance. And so we should operate in our lives as well, in friendships around us or in businesses around us, at our work, at our school, or wherever we find ourselves with, is we should first sit at the Father's feet and allow him to come and fill us up. And then out of that, go and give. Because then that changes our perspective on everything. Because it's not what they can give to me, because I don't actually need them to give me anything, because I already received everything from the Father, but rather what I can give to them. So it completely changes that balance. So in Jesus' life, we see a beautiful example of him not only being lonely sometimes, but him being in solitude and the power that comes with that, and the balance that comes with both. So just a few practical things on what to do with loneliness is, first of all, do not think the worst of people. I think that's our first offense, is they don't care, they never really loved me, they don't want to spend time with me, etc., etc. So we automatically think the worst instead of thinking the best of people. So remember that Jesus says that we live to love other people. So we need to train our thoughts in that way and not think in offense. So it all boils back down to offense. Don't take offense, don't give offense, don't think offense. We also need to choose to keep our speculations positive. So being positive is a choice. I say this a lot to the teenagers. Being positive is a choice. You have authority over your emotions. So you get to choose whether you're going to be happy or not. Doesn't mean there's not going to come instances where you're disappointed or sad, but it's something you train yourself in, how you handle certain situations. It's like an athlete at the end of the day. Starts out difficult, but the more they train, the easier it becomes. So you get to choose to have positive speculations about people, and that will keep you away from loneliness, because you don't think the worst of people. Because the moment you think the worst of people, you enter into offense automatically, and that takes you to isolation. Secondly, avoid generalizations, because when we're lonely, we find we most of the time think, I'm never invited to anything, or they always avoid you. So avoid generalizations like the word never or always or whatever, because that's not the truth, and it can cause a vicious cycle. If you look at Proverbs 18 verse 1, it says, the selfish man lives only for himself. So if you feel excluded and therefore you isolate yourself, it makes you feel lonely, which in turn leads you to feeling excluded. It's a vicious cycle, and the selfish man only lives for himself. So rather believe the best of others. Just keep on trusting, even when you hear bad news. There's a quiet trust in the Lord that He will cause all things to work together for the good. Then the second one is always choose older friends. So that's actually a biblical thing. Is you can look at David and Jonathan. Jonathan was older than David. Ruth and Naomi, Timothy and Paul, they all had age differences, because there is a great value in friends that already have the wisdom that you still need to get. So
Amen to that one.
Ek is omsingel deur ou mense, wat die ander?
Ja, ek sê
My gevaarlike kan sê doodheid op.
Mense het die doodheid oproep, maar ek dink ou Grieke en jy is nog aan mekaar.
So that's a way that you can avoid being lonely, is draw from the wisdom of the people that have the wisdom that you don't have. Then the next one is get comfortable with your own company. I think a lot of the times we get agitated with our own company because you said it earlier before we even started, we live busy lives, and so sometimes we're not used to being alone. Or maybe it's a psychological thing where you went through something when you're younger and you just genuinely don't like to be alone. But get comfortable with being on your own, because I think solitude doesn't happen with a bunch of people around you. So you need to actually quiet yourself down, and in order to sometimes quiet yourself down, you have to quiet things around you down. And you're not going to be comfortable in that situation if you're not comfortable with your own company. You don't have to feel lonely when you're alone. As mentioned before, Jesus was a social person, but he also realized the value of being alone, because if he was alone, he could spend time in prayer with his Father. The same can apply to you. Do not consider it a disadvantage when you're alone, but rather use this time to reflect on and appreciate your blessings. And then just another biblical principle that comes into play there is the word says, love your neighbor as yourself. And in order to do that, you actually need to love yourself. So that's a scripture that I love very much because I love myself. But take care of yourself and be patient with yourself also. And you need to have those moments where you're comfortable with being yourself, or comfortable with your own company, to be able to take care of yourself and to be patient with yourself, to figure out what you have to work on, to actually sit at the Father's feet. Then the next one is concentrate on your strengths. So get to know who you are and acknowledge that you can't be everything for everyone. It becomes tiring if you try to live up to everyone's expectations. So concentrate on your strengths. So that's another thing that can sometimes cause aloneness or loneliness, is that we want to be everything for everyone, but we can't. And then we start self-doubting, and we start looking negatively at ourselves. Like creates the thoughts that I said earlier you shouldn't have, the negative thoughts, and then that creates isolation, etc., etc. And then the last one is show genuine interest to others. Key word being genuine interest to others, not the well, hoe gaan het? Ek is cool boy. But actually genuinely care. I once shared here at the Bible school on how to actually get people to talk about their lives. I don't even ask them how are you anymore, because it's a generalized antwoord. Wanneer het gaan goed. So now if I speak to people, I say, hello, hoe gaan het? How's life? That throws them, because now you're actually asking them how's life, and now they actually have to talk about how's life being. But then the key there is not just to ask how's life, because now it's just another catchphrase of you. You actually have to care about how their life is going. So you have to show genuine interest. It helps to get to know others better if you just ask them how they are doing. And then other points that you can look at that, in showing genuine interest in others is cultivate compassion, talk to others the way you want them to talk to you, look for meaningful conversations or forums, get out of the house. That's an important one. And then an important one as well is kindness. Just smile to someone, show genuine interest. And I think these are all things that Jesus was a beautiful example of. That even sometimes when he felt aloneness, he didn't allow himself to be led to isolation, but he rather drew power from solitude. So yes, that was Jesus, the best life ever lived, Christ in his aloneness. I didn't look at the camera once, so welcome. But we are now done with that session. I really hope that you could draw something and identify with Jesus' life there, or get some tips on how to, navigate that. But yes, thank you for joining us.